No one really cares about anti-Semitism. What we're talking about is extremism and Islamic jihad versus democracy in the West. This is a group that has been funded, that's been organized by foreign forces from adjacent organizations tied to Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, American Muslims for Palestine. This FBI wiretap was listening to members of Hamas in America talking about how they were going to infiltrate American institutions. This is 30 plus years ago. How did we get to this moment where Hamas is being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than being condemned as terrorists?
Everybody seemed primed, without even knowing it, to repeat those messages: genocide, apartheid.
This is not about the Bibi Netanyahu government. It's not about Israeli policies. It's not about land disputes.
We're not talking about a small amount of money.
Money's coming from Qatar, money's coming from China, money's coming from Iran.
And it's obviously going to compromise their ability to teach in a Western, American, liberal way.
Universities are businesses. Why wouldn't they take this money? Qatar is buying up America. They're buying the lobbyists, they're buying sports teams, they're buying arenas. They are buying America right now.
Have they offered to stop you?
Yeah.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Wendy Sachs, welcome to London. Welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you're here, I know, for a screening of your October 8th film. And it's quite a powerful film about what happened in Israel after the invasion by Hamas and the Palestinians, and then what happened around the world. So tell me a little bit, firstly, about the film for people who don't know it, and about how it's been received here in the UK.
So the film opens on October 7th, but really the film is about October 8th and the aftermath of when Hamas attacked Israel. What the film really ladders up to is, how did we get to this moment where Hamas is being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than being condemned as terrorists? On the most elite campuses in America, on the streets of America, and social media, how did this evolution happen? How did we get here?
And what do you mean by that? Because I think a lot of people who are, let's say, critical of Israel, especially on campuses and places like that, they'll say, well, we're not celebrating Hamas. Actually, we're celebrating the Palestinian liberation movement. We're celebrating a people who've undergone the horrors of now 2 years of disastrous war that's killed so many of them. So what do you mean when you say that those people are celebrating Hamas?
Well, the film opens on October 7th, and you're seeing the horrific raw footage coming out from the Hamas GoPro cams. But really, it's on October 8th when we see what's happening in New York Times Square, when truly there's a celebration of Hamas as freedom fighters, when the bodies haven't even been counted yet. We don't know how many people have been murdered, how many people are raped. We don't even know how many people have been taken as hostages into Gaza on October 8th. But already we're hearing the chants coming from Times Square. We're seeing it happening around the world, here in London too, and the streets of Australia. And we're also hearing right away on October 8th that more than 30 student groups at Harvard had signed on to a letter blaming Israel for the attack on itself. I mean, it really felt like the world had lost its mind. And it was in that context that I started putting together October 8th, and I had a treatment for the film within 2 weeks of October 7th, and I started filming right away. So we're not talking about the war in Gaza. In fact, I'm really, really intentional to not litigate the war. This is not about the Bibi Netanyahu government. It's not about Israeli policies. It's not about land disputes. It really unpacks anti-Semitism today and the evolution of anti-Semitism, which has turned into a fanatical anti-Zionism. And it also, a bigger, greater theme is, it's not about Jews. It's not about the state of Israel. Frankly, it's not even about anti-Semitism. No one really cares about anti-Semitism. What we're talking about is extremism and Islamic jihad versus democracy in the West. And that bigger theme is really what the film's about. And I think it's why the film's doing so well around the world. This is not a film that I intended for Jewish audiences. While, yes, Jewish audiences are seeing the film, feeling affirmed by what they're seeing. It's almost a primal scream for the Jewish community. But really, I intended the film to be for global audiences, for non-Jewish audiences. And I've taken the film around the world, to Australia, to Latin America, to Germany, to Canada. Here in the UK, I just came from Scotland recently. And the film is being widely embraced. Same thing in the Netherlands, where the Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands came to the film and gave an incredible keynote speech all about extremism versus democracy.
It's interesting because, you say you got this treatment together within 2 weeks. I remember after 1 week, the first big thing that I did was Fox News made a documentary, Who is Benjamin Netanyahu, released 1 week after. I happened to revisit it recently. And it made me remember what it was like during those early days and weeks, because I think now, whoever you are and whatever your opinions are, so much has happened that it's hard to remember exactly what we did know then and what we had seen and the reaction. So as you say, you noted the horrific backlash against Jews internationally, in your case in the US. Let's dig a bit deeper, because one of the most fascinating parts of the film for me was where you talked about SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, which seemed to mobilize literally the second the news came through. I remember here, I woke up very early in the morning. In the States, there's the time difference. But as I was basically looking at that news unfolding live, real time on my phone, they were doing what in the US?
They were already celebrating. I mean, they were so organized. And I think that's really what we saw, and that's what the film reflects in your mentioning SJP. That's the student group on campus. But let me be clear, this isn't like another student group. It's not like Students for Climate Change or Students for Reproductive Freedom or Students for LGBTQ rights. This is a group that has been funded, that's been organized by foreign forces. And that is what we're examining and exposing in this film. And in fact, the SJP chapters, many of them had been shuttered on college campuses around America for many, many years. And then strangely, they came to life in the days preceding October 7th. That's also what we didn't present in the film, because I didn't really have what I would call the receipts and real evidence to show. There were some conspiracy theories out there saying, why are these SJP chapters suddenly coming alive, as if they knew something was going to happen October 7th. And there seems to be more evidence pointing to that. But regardless of whether they had some inside knowledge coming from Hamas members or aligned organizations, letting them know that they should be ready for something major happening on October 7th, the fact of the matter is the messaging is spread and circulated and very well organized. And we actually even show this in a toolkit, in a media toolkit that SJP put out on Google Documents, that's showing the messaging to use, the iconography to use, that upside down red triangle that they tag everywhere. And for your audience who may not know what that is, that upside down red triangle is used by Hamas when they're targeting IDF soldiers.
Just to be clear, they used that from the earliest days, from the first 2 weeks?
That's right.
Before any Hamas videos had been released using that red triangle.
They're using that pretty much right away. Like after October 7th news breaks, SJP is saying, flood the streets, flood the streets, flood is the Al-Aqsa flood.
Which is what the Palestinians called the invasion of Israel.
That's exactly right. The same messaging, the same language, and then that upside down red triangle, that target that Hamas uses to identify IDF soldiers before they kill them, that is now being painted, spray painted on the Benjamin Franklin statue at the University of Pennsylvania. It's being tagged all around America, particularly on college campuses.
And to be clear, as you said, for people who don't know, that red triangle became iconic of Hamas.
That's right.
Partly because I assume it's the red triangle from the PLO flag, which has then been inverted, and it was used in the Hamas videos that they released, which we now know were micro-produced and directed by Abu Ubaidah, who Israel assassinated, their communications guru. And they were used in images where they were attacking Israeli troops within Gaza. They would have a little red triangle pointing to where they were going to shoot or blow up. So the idea that they're using it on campuses in the US, on statues and things like that, is inherently a reference to violence, right?
Absolutely. And just even circling back to sort of SJP, it was started by Hatem Bazian back in the late 1990s in Berkeley. And this is an organization that's not a 501c3, which is a nonprofit entity in America. It has no real status anywhere. And yet, we know that it's receiving funding from adjacent organizations tied to Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood, American Muslims for Palestine, all of these various groups that are funneling money, creating messaging. It's sophisticated, it's savvy. This is not organic, and this is no accident.
And watching the film, one of the things I found interesting was the history of SJP,
Mm-hmm.
because you played in the film some recordings, I think, that the FBI had done of
Yeah.
this early meeting of them planning how they were going to create a network of propaganda effectively in the US that would talk to US sensibilities, students, people on the left. And you mentioned to me before, you haven't put in some of the hours of footage, but how they worked out how to speak to every part of US society. So firstly, tell me a bit more about that, how you came across these incredible recordings where we hear the actual architects of this let's say, capture of US institutions and universities planning exactly what we saw unfolding, not just on October the 7th, 8th, but also in the decades preceding it.
So what we reveal in this film is this FBI wiretap is what you're alluding to. And it was a wiretap that came from a 1993 Marriott hotel room in Philadelphia, where the FBI was listening to members of Hamas in America talking about how they were going to infiltrate American institutions. They wanted to infiltrate the media. They wanted to infiltrate university campuses. This is 30 plus years ago, that they were already sophisticated and savvy enough to know how to message their way into American audiences and to make their messaging more palatable. So when they were speaking to people on the left, they're going to speak in terms of genocide and apartheid and colonialism. When they're speaking to people on the right, they're going to frame it in terms of the founding fathers and patriotism. And at that time in 1983, Hamas actually wasn't recognized as a terrorist organization in America, but already there are eyes and ears listening in. And what we know now is that they had been really planting the seeds and playing the long game for decades. And I think that's what's so shocking to audiences is realizing this is not new. This is a really long time in the making.
And I think that it's important to note what you just said, that they weren't a prescribed terror group in the US. And even here in the UK, there was a long time where they weren't prescribed in their totality.
Mm-hmm.
There's always been this distinction with Hamas and other terror groups like that of the political wing and the militant wing. And then eventually governments and states get round to understanding that the two are basically connected. So in this case, before they were prescribed, what they're doing, you're saying, is there were Hamas representatives in the US in the 90s.
Yeah,
who are
1993.
Right. So I was having my bar mitzvah and they were planning international intifada.
That's
and
right.
I think that what's interesting is that some will say, well, fair enough, like all kinds of state actors or non-state actors or pressure groups or lobbies do that all the time. They work out how to put their message across for their cause and their people to the audience of another country or another government or another state. So in a way, they're doing exactly what other people would do, what perhaps Israel would do in terms of getting their message across. But how did they manage to make it so pervasive in the campuses that on October the 8th, everybody seemed primed without even knowing it to repeat those messages: genocide, apartheid?
That's what's so interesting is that this has been festering for a really long time. So it didn't just happen in the past few years. It's really been marinating for decades on college campuses. What I would say is that what was more fringe, a few years ago, 5, 10 years ago in America has really become very mainstream and normalized right now. And I think with social media, that messaging really just exploded. And it really took over. And we were seeing more of this antipathy towards Israel and this perversion of narratives, probably in the past 10 years. But again, it was more localized. It was a little bit more, I would argue, a little bit more fringe, no longer. And I truly do think that through TikTok and through the images that young people were seeing online coming out of, again, distorted narratives about Israel, about Jews, just tropes with anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories and all of that, it became the perfect storm. And they were just really ready to go on October 8th.
It's interesting because I'd agree with that. And I would say that here in the UK, for those of us who covered these sorts of stories long before this current flare-up in the region, it was clear that even on campuses here, there were efforts to run things like Israel Apartheid Week.
Right.
And I think that many people in the rest of society who weren't into all that just kind of shrugged it off and said, well, they're a bit nuts, or students do this sort of thing, let them be. And some of their efforts seemed really pathetic when you would see them. Do you think that the message that you found from making the film is that actually people should have cared, they should have addressed it? You can't just say it looks insignificant and stupid now, they're a bunch of clowns, they'll grow out of it. You have to see it when it's small and nip it in the bud.
I think it really comes down to this idea of this whole oppressor-oppressed ideology that is also really at the heart of what we're seeing right now, which again isn't new. This sort of Marxist, socialist, anti-West, anti-democratic philosophy, ideology that's been in academia for a really long time. That's really gained steam in the past few years. For my next project, I'm looking at the origin story of this and charting the path to how this has all happened. And I think a real inflection point is really 2020 and George Floyd and what we saw in the States, and then, of course, what was spread around the world. And coming out of that, coming out of those years, the COVID years, this sort of oppressor-oppressed mentality, that is really what the far left has really grabbed onto to make this whole idea, even towards Israel, more mainstream, this real hate towards Israel, ignoring the fact that Israel wasn't even in Gaza for the past, since 2005. But that didn't matter on October 7th, on October 8th. I think, again, this idea of oppressor, oppressed, and Israel as the oppressor helped turn that idea, that image of Hamas into freedom fighters really on its head.
It's really interesting that you mentioned George Floyd, because I do agree that, again, watching from this side of the pond, it did kind of come here a bit, which was even stranger because it wasn't really our issue. And people tried to make the Black experience in the UK somehow the same as in the US. And, for sure, there's racism for Black people, but it's a very different matter. And that's what I think really shows the truth in what you just said. There was a sort of formula, a playbook that seems to be applied even where it didn't quite fit. Now, from what you say, it sounds like you don't believe it was organic. It's not that students naturally like social justice causes. It's not that they really identified systemic racism and that was the end of the story. It's that someone is manipulating their tendencies in that direction for ulterior motives. And you mentioned Marxism there. And I want to ask about that because, we know that there is an Islamist, jihadist, maximalist motivation behind what some people call now Palestinianism. But we don't necessarily understand fully why the far left and Marxism has kind of latched onto that. Is it that they both have just a desire to harness the natural drive of young people to kind of rebel in order to bring down or undermine our societies as they are? And in that case, are Palestinians not just being used in that context?
Well, I think there is a romanticism behind Marxism and socialism with young people, and that I feel like that story is an old one. That's not a new one. But I think that in recent years, it has just become much more mainstream. I'm looking in for my next project, which is really a follow-up to October 8th. It's called Poison Ivy, and we can talk about that later. But I'm really digging into, again, the origin of academia with an ideology that has become so anti-democratic, anti-West, and very pro-Marxist and pro-socialist, and also at the same time very anti-Semitic. And what is that? And it's not just happening in university campuses, it's actually happening in K through 12 also. It's happening in the curriculum that we're seeing in America, but around the world. For this next project, I'm looking at what's happening here in the UK with education, what's happening not just in academia, but also in your medical schools here and the training that's happening, what's happening in Australia and in Canada. Very, very similar. And this, again, it's this idea of the oppressor-oppressed binary, this colonialism and what that looks like. And it's really within that framework that I think we're seeing this manifestation of all of the anti-Semitism, certainly anti-Zionism, and just Jew hatred around the world.
Well, so let's talk then a bit about the next project, because if October 8th was a film really for beginners, or let's say people who didn't know anything about the anti-Semitism on campus and also didn't have a full vision of what was going on with what happened on October the 7th, your next film seems to be latching onto the territory we covered when we talked about SJP and others, the influence within campuses and elsewhere in society. You've talked about how institutions have been captured. Who is behind it? Is it all Qatar?
But that's what I'm examining right now. We do think that Qatar is responsible for a lot of the funding that's happening on college campuses. We know that. We know that it's billions of dollars of money that they have been fueling into university campuses in America and abroad. Here in the UK, they're also funding programs in Australia, in Canada for sure. In Germany, we're looking into that as well. Money's coming from Qatar, money's coming from China, money's coming from Iran. And again, they are funding not just universities and not just funding chairs and fellowships. There's actually universities in Doha, an education city, my alma mater, Northwestern University. I went to the journalism school there. I've been honestly obsessed with looking at these universities in Doha to see what's happening there. There was a longstanding relationship with Al Jazeera, with Northwestern University in Qatar. Qatar has given about $730 million to Northwestern in the past 12 years or so. Where's that money going? It's a very small campus there. The people who are working, the faculty who are working at the Northwestern University campus in Doha have been connected to terrorism indirectly, but it's very, very sketchy.
And what are you finding? Is there a quid pro quo? Is it as clear as we give this money, you teach this? Or is it more a sense of kind of self-censorship and self-molding? You know, I wouldn't like to teach this a way that would upset our biggest donors.
Right. It's both. We're finding that the Qatar Foundation, who is then funding these campuses, and I'm looking particularly right now at Northwestern, there's sort of more evidence coming out because there's been a lot of congressional testimony about Northwestern, that yes, in fact, for the funding, there are classes that need to be taught, and one is about the history of Qatar and of framing it in the Palestinian context. And it's being taught by faculty members who, again, have an ideological bent that probably people would find to be fairly biased when it comes to certainly Israel, if not Jews in general, and adjacent to other organizations that have been found guilty of money laundering, money going to Hamas and to other terror organizations. So, but then there's also a lot of sort of more subtle ways that the money is coming in. And to be honest, with this film, we're trying to find what I always call the receipts, but the evidence on where's the money going and then what's actually happening after these universities are getting the funding. And some of it's just more opaque and we don't really know. What we do know is that Qatar has been funding a curriculum called Teach Palestine in the United States, and that goes into K through 12, and they do it under the guise of teaching Arabic. But we also know that under this program of teaching Arabic, this curriculum has also been framed in terms of the colonizer, the colonized, the oppressor, the oppressed. And within that framework, Israel is always, the oppressor. And in that binary, there's definitely some anti-Semitic ideology and tropes that are coming out. There's one story that came out of a Brooklyn elementary school where there was a map of the Middle East and Israel was erased. And, that caused all sorts of news stories in America to say, what is going on here?
So when it comes to Qatar, actually, I think it's interesting because I've been following it a bit as well. And we're not talking about a small amount of money.
No.
Between 2001 and 2021, US higher education institutions received around $13 billion in funding from foreign sources. Yeah. Of that, Qatar was reported to have contributed 4.7 billion approximately. And then we see, as you said, specific places. Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh reportedly received $301 million from Qatar between 2020 and 2023. That's this amount of money going into US institutions. Surely they're not totally stupid. What's their reason for accepting these vast sums when it's obviously going to compromise their ability to teach in a Western American liberal way?
These are businesses. I mean, universities are businesses, and they're being offered enormous sums of money. This means that they don't need to raise money from donors, from alumni. why wouldn't they take this money, right? And there's just no transparency as far as having to declare what you're doing with this money. This is a huge problem in America, and Congress is looking into this now. But to be fair, Qatar is buying up America on both sides of the aisle. On the left, on the right, they're buying the lobbyists, they're buying sports teams, they're buying arenas. They are buying America right now. And it is like everyone is vulnerable. And it's incredible because these universities have been taking in these enormous sums of money for many, many years. The money has actually skyrocketed in the past few years, as you just pointed out. And there's no transparency on what's happening with the funding.
Well, it's not just in America. I mean, there have been a few pieces of coverage recently here in the UK about how much real estate Qatar owns in London, where we are, with some reports saying that they own more than the Crown, more than King Charles III. So, their property portfolio here is over £10 billion, including prime offices, hotels, retail. So I think that many people don't see it because even though it's there in plain sight, it's stuff you don't think about. Who owns the tower that your office is in or that your TV channels are based in? And I think that there seems to be an abandonment, though, on the part of these businesses, as you call them, but they are universities, they're seats of learning, when they don't care. They just need the money, and here's the highest bidder. But it comes with strings. Now, I want to ask, though, with Trump withdrawing funding from US colleges who aren't going to comply with anti-Semitism regulations, is he potentially pushing them towards accepting money from much worse places?
It's a great question, Jonathan, and I think it does, actually. There's a fear now that international students aren't going to be able to enter the United States. They're the ones who pay full ticket to go to American institutions. A lot of other American students are, get financial aid, they get government grants, but the international population pays full fare. And so with losing international student funding, losing government funding because of accusations of anti-Semitism and all sorts of other things, you're making these universities, I would argue, maybe more susceptible to increased foreign funding coming in from abroad. It does feel like everywhere is compromised right now.
But on the other hand, these universities are refusing the requirements of the Trump administration, which says, we'll give you the money if you do X, Y, Z about anti-Semitism. But they're not refusing the money from Qatar, which is saying, if you teach a completely warped and anti-Semitic syllabus, we'll give you the money. So why is it then that this educational institution has been so captured, and how that it is actually willing to take money with strings attached, just not from the US government to teach in line with US and pluralistic values, but instead from a tyrannical, terror-hosting microstate, which still has slavery, sponsors terrorism, and effectively has bankrolled and supported Hamas for years. Why on earth has US educational landscape become effectively Islamist, anti-American, anti-liberal, and anti-Jewish?
Another great question. I do think that with the Qataris funding and even with the Chinese, they're not necessarily specific about a curriculum that you need to teach. They might fund a fellowship and say, we want you to hire this guy for it. Or we're going to increase your Middle East studies program, and we're going to make sure that there are, internships happening at Al Jazeera, for instance, or we'll do a study abroad program, or let's send your teachers to our conference in Doha, and we're going to fly them first class accommodations. And it becomes just very palatable. They do it in a really smart way that feels good. It feels like an added value to these institutions. They think that they're getting a benefit out of this. I mean, what's being disclosed now from Northwestern is that in their agreement, in Northwestern University's agreement with Qatar, they are signing agreements saying that they actually can't criticize the Qatari government, that their students, their faculty in Doha cannot be critical of the Qatari government, that they are actually going to adhere to the regime's no free speech policies, why Northwestern and why their journalism school agreed to do this is just like beyond bizarre. And it doesn't really, to me, make any sense, but they knew who they were getting into bed with. So there was a clear delineation on sort of what the expectations are going to be. And there are some caveats also in some courses that need to be taught. To me, that's very, very alarming.
It's the hypocrisy of low expectations, really, because if the Trump administration offered them similar amount of money but said you have to hire this guy, or you're not allowed to criticize my administration, not only would they not take the money, they would make a huge stink about it. But when this tyrannical Islamist government does it, they say thank you very much, and can I have a nice trip to Qatar and a holiday in your, but then again, some will say Trump is as guilty as anyone else. Offer him a golden aeroplane and perhaps he's also viable. So how are we going to counter this? Are you finding any of this in the making of the new film? Because effectively we're talking about a state with a tiny population, which is effectively run on slave labor and foreign labor within the country. I don't know if people realize it, but Qatar has more foreigners working in it than it has citizens. That has so much money, just like endless, limitless amounts of money because of the natural resources it controls. And it is therefore able to buy literally anyone. I mean, have they offered to stop you?
Not yet. Not yet. I'm just in the early stages of production on the film. So
you're waiting for the offer, right?
We'll see how much money they offer.
If I see you cancel the film and buy a new house and a gold plane,
you're
right?
going to know. Yeah.
No, but I mean, in all seriousness, it's a massive problem because if you can't buy an institution, you can buy an individual. So how do we get to the bottom of that? I mean, I've heard stories about TV productions, even within the BBC, where the allegation was that, no, they hadn't bought the BBC, but maybe they'd influenced some individuals who were working within the institution, and the BBC won't know about it, but that person, maybe they're getting some of the perks you've talked about.
There's no question. And I'm actually, as I'm vetting my people, my experts for my interviews for the next film, for the Poison Ivy film, I'm realizing that a lot of people, frankly, are compromised. And it's problematic because it does feel like the Qataris have their tentacles are spread so far and vast, and that so many people in government, there's so many lobbyists. There's former members of Congress, Jim Moran, who's the head lobbyist for Qatar. He was a former congressman from Virginia. He happened to be actually very anti-Israel and some would argue anti-Semitic. He's now the head lobbyist for the Qataris in D.C., a longtime member of Congress. PR firms, lobbying firms, communications firms in D.C., all touched, influenced by Qatari money. It's really challenging, to be honest, because as I'm starting this film and doing this deep dive, you never know who you're talking to. And by the way, we haven't even talked about their influence on social media, which is another whole war, the propaganda war online, which is why I think young minds have been so hijacked in the West, not just in the States, but around the world.
So I think what you're touching on there is the idea that if they're funding universities or other institutions, then there should be a layer above that that is policing that funding. But it's fine because they'll just buy that layer too. At every stage, the answer to the problem for Qatar or others like them is, well, we'll just pay the people who are meant to be stopping us doing this.
Right.
And at the end of it, it means, politicians are not famed for being whiter than white anywhere in the world. If they will take funding for their political causes, then they will perhaps be a bit more lenient on those they're meant to be policing.
Sure.
Ultimately, then, isn't what we're talking about a rediscovery of truth and decency and values that we need to somehow inject back into society from the top, from governments and politics, through the media and down to universities, where, I asked you maybe somewhat naively, why are these universities accepting this obviously tainted money? And you said, because they're businesses. But they're not just businesses. And journalists aren't just business people. And the politicians aren't just people with a mortgage to pay and a car to pay for and kids to send to school. These are all people who ought to have, and I do believe that many of them still have, a sense of public service, civic duty. Where are, in your experience, the people who are actually immune to this bribery, people who have decency and values, and how can we bolster them in those key institutions in our society?
Oh, that's another great question. I mean, I think people like Jonathan Sacerdoti from the FDD, who has been sort of shouting to the bullhorn for many, many years about the threat of Qatar. I just interviewed him for Poison Ivy. I interviewed him for October 8. He came out of the Treasury Department, and he's been at this think tank that's doing a lot of investigation into Qatar funding right now and Iranian funding of universities, of academia. There are members of Congress who, like Richie Torres, who also appears on October 8th. I think he's unapologetic and standing up for the Jewish community and speaking out on anti-Semitism, and also calling out the foreign actors who have really had their finger on the scale of what we're seeing, particularly on social media. There are people out there who still have a real moral compass and an integrity. It's just challenging. I mean, I think we're living in challenging times. We haven't even spoken about the entertainment industry that's also really been compromised, or certainly hijacked, I would argue, by the Qataris, who are just flooding Hollywood with money and supporting a lot of filmmakers, a lot of Palestinian filmmakers. They're funding Watermelon Pictures, which is a Hadid operation that has a real ideological agenda. I mean, they've been paying and financing Zoran Mamdani's mother's films for years, for more than a decade now, just totally financing her film. She's a very well-known filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker. She also does feature and narrative films, and the Qataris have been funding her. And it doesn't mean that all of these films are hateful, terrible, conspiracy types of films. But what I'm saying is we do have a foreign government who doesn't necessarily have our best interests in mind. And while they are supposedly an American ally, which is why our relationship is so complicated, they are flooding the market with money. And then it's no surprise that we see such vitriol against Jews or films like mine that are at all sympathetic to what happened on October 7th. So we are getting blocked out of film festivals. There's a lot of controversy out there. My film was actually sabotaged during the Academy Award process, during its campaign, because of what was happening on the other side of the issue. Again, this isn't organic. I would argue that this is really sophisticated and well-organized campaigns against Jewish films, or, again, anything that seems to be Zionist-related or sympathetic to Israel.
So, that's what they say about us. They say Jews control Hollywood, Jews use their money to control the media, Jews lobby the government, AIPAC pays off all of the US politicians. Aren't you just guilty of doing the same thing?
It sounds that way, right? I mean, I hate to cry conspiracy theory, and I hate to even just call it, oh, it's all anti-Semitism. But the more evidence that comes out, the more things that are being revealed. Even on how my film's IMDb page was targeted with bots and with a campaign, and I'm actually uncovering who's behind it all. Same thing happened with Sheryl Sandberg's film Screams Before Silence. There was a campaign that was organized, and it doesn't matter how many times I've reached out to IMDb, anyone can look at the numbers, anyone can see these reviews and see how inauthentic it is. There are campaigns to target films like mine. And, the facts speak for themselves.
So is the only way then to counter this torrent, this flood of money from the wrong places that obviously has an influence, to fight fire with fire? Do we need to find endless amounts of money from people on the other side, or does that make us as bad as them? Is there a way instead to make people aware of this and to reject it? I mean, at the end of the day, very few people don't have a price. And if you've got enough money, you can find someone's price. And if that person is high up enough or has enough influence, then it will trickle downwards. What do you prescribe as the medicine for this illness?
That's the million-dollar question. I mean, I think that there are a lot of people who are compromised. And I think back to your question, do we fight fire with fire? We do. I actually think that we need to, and that we need to punch back hard. And what I'm seeing is post-October 7th, speaking as an American Jew, a diaspora Jew, I think a lot of us were asleep at the wheel and didn't understand what was happening. There was a lot of complacency, particularly in the United States, among American Jewry, where, we're small in numbers, we're less than 3% of the population, but we've historically, for at least the past, 50 years or so, punched above our weight. And we over-index in all of the industries, whether it's entertainment and media and real estate and finance. And, people thought we're good. We're good now, only to learn that we're not. And in a post-October 7th world, I think that the Jewish community has really come together, not just in the States, but I've been taking my film around the world, and I'm seeing it around the world. People are really waking up and realizing we need to come together. And whether it's using our finances and our funds and our connection, but we need to punch back harder. And we're seeing that right now in Hollywood too. And I can speak to that first person because having gone through this whole journey, but we're also outnumbered. And so as hard as we can punch back and throw everything that we have at it, we are still swimming upstream.
But we're outnumbered and we're outdollared, and that's the point. We may out-index others as Jews, and I hate to say it, we and them and us and they.
Right.
It shouldn't be that
Sounds
way.
very tribal.
At the end of the day, this isn't about Jews outnumbering Qatar or Muslims or Islam or any other country. It's actually about right and wrong, and that's, I suppose, what I keep. I don't know why I expect you to have an answer for it, because I'm not sure any of us does. But ultimately, it's about values and it's about influence, and it seems to me that what you're saying is that it's a lost cause. Because if they can outsmart us with money and influence and numbers, and then, as you said, we haven't touched on social media, let's go there. From the bottom to the top, they're influencing people's thoughts and opinions in such a way that most people don't even know the level to which they're being manipulated. So if you watch TikTok, or if you watch videos online, or if you have things that you think you wanted to watch on YouTube, and the algorithm told you wanted to watch them, you were fed them. These things all play a part, and it seems like it's a pincer movement. It's more than a pincer movement. It's from every direction: money, influence, numbers, propaganda. You're one woman making 2 films on this now, and my hat off to you for it. How on earth can we compete with that?
I mean, it sounds pretty doom and gloom, and I think a lot of it is really overwhelming. I mean, this landscape that you just set up is pretty terrifying, and I think we're getting to this tipping point right now. And I'd like to think that we're really sort of on the cusp of everything exploding. I'm also following a whole thread that's happening with Wikipedia, and I'm going to be interviewing for the film people who are investigating the bias in Wikipedia, not just an anti-Israel bias, but something actually much deeper that's happening from a very sort of woke, extremist, well-funded Islamist also organizations that are actually funding Wikipedia. And Wikipedia is connected to academia because AI is pulling all of this Wikipedia information and it's going into AI, and it's the sort of robotic learning that's actually broadcasting to the world truth versus fact and fiction, and it's what our young people are learning, and it's very, very troubling. I would argue that while we are small in numbers, the issues are much bigger, again, than Jews and anti-Semitism and the state of Israel. And we really are talking about democracy, democratic values, Western values. And my hope is that that is what's going to captivate a bigger audience to take action. And that's what's going to compel governments around the world to start regulating. And it's going to compel elected leaders to do something. Because, we're not going to win this alone. And I am a little bit more optimistic, and I don't have the answers yet because, again, I'm sort of in the early stages of investigating sort of where we're at and what needs to be done. And I'll come back to you with that when we have a finished film. But I am optimistic that the pendulum is going to start swinging back a little bit. I think we're seeing that a little bit more now in a post-October 7th world. Not as fast as I'd like to see it, but eyes are opening to, wait, what the hell is going on here? And particularly on American college campuses. People aren't liking what they're being told with how their kids' learning has been hijacked by foreign institutions. It's not landing well. And I'm talking about outside of the Jewish world. I'm talking about the Christian world. I'm talking about the evangelical community. I'm talking about the Catholic community. People aren't happy with hearing that professors are so off the rails in their extremist views, that the curriculums that they're teaching, that the books that they're having their students read, again, are so anti-capitalist. They're so anti-American. They're so anti-democratic. And particularly what's happening in the K through 12 classrooms. where they're just erasing history is alarming to people outside of the Jewish world. And I think that is going to really, and I'm seeing it already firsthand at the local levels, at the school board levels, that communities are reacting.
No, well, I've talked about this before. That this isn't really a Jewish issue. That we're both Jews, but and as a result, that means that we, I think, feel this acutely because it's kind of being targeted at us predominantly or primarily at the moment. But it's also being targeted at everyone else. So I think where a lot of Jews woke up to it on or around October the 7th, 23, many had been following it for a long time before. Many have woken up to it since then. Many more. But I think, as you say, the rest of society is starting to wake up to it. Here in the UK, there's quite a big movement. And that in itself is also quite alarming, especially for Jews, because generally, and non-Jews,
Right.
I think the chaos that's ensuing in society is really difficult. And you mentioned that maybe regulation will help, but then who regulates? Who introduces regulation? Governments and politicians. And we've already discussed how corrupt or corruptible, let's say, governments and politicians are. The point is that if at every stage everyone is corruptible, do you think societies, especially after COVID, you mentioned it earlier, are going to accept really tough levels of regulation, effectively limits on freedoms, limits on all kinds of behaviors, especially when those limits are going to be placed on our freedoms by people who we suspect to compromise themselves? How can we reinstill in politicians and then in the public a level of trust, of decency, and of a shared mission to make people fall in love again with all those things that you and I are talking about protecting: democracy, freedom, education, truth, justice, real justice?
Right.
Where do we start? Do we start making people fall in love with that stuff again and then accept that their leaders and politicians are on the same side as them and then accept a level of regulation, or the other way around? Is it top down? Is it Trump style? I'm in office, executive order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,000. This will happen like this. At what point do we have to just hold up our hands and say we've lost?
Well, we're never going to say we've lost because we can't throw in the towel. There's too much at stake. And I think we have really lost our liberal values. And I mean that in the sort of old fashioned, and I think it is very alarming. And I think, is it coming from the top down, from sort of a Trump-like style? It's interesting because some of the things that he's doing with the administration, particularly making the universities accountable, it's effective. We might not like sort of all of the ways that he's going about it. And there's a lot of pushback that's happening in America because we're also seeing some other very aggressive measures happening with immigration and with ICE and people being rounded up. And no one likes to see that either. And you can't sort of pick and choose what you like out of sort of policies that feel to some people a little fascist and a little, bit of an overreach. But some things are arguably effective. But I think more importantly, we need it to come from within, right? We need to drive this from our own sensibility of we are losing, I could say in America, the soul of America. Throughout the West, I would say the soul of democracy. We're losing what we really hold dear. And I think, again, it's coming from, we haven't really touched on the third rail, which is Islamophobia, and this idea of being called a racist. There's so much out there in the world of cancel culture that, again, has really sort of blown up over the past, since like the 2020 era, since the Me Too era, so a little bit earlier than that, but in that same zeitgeisty moment of cancel culture. And being called a racist is the worst possible thing you could ever be called. And so what we see all the time is this comparison between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And it just doesn't exist in the same way in America. I can speak it for sure. We don't see the same levels of hate on both sides. And yet, what we see time and time again, particularly on schools, whether it's a middle school or high school or university campus, you'll never hear an administrator talk only about anti-Semitism. They always need to wrap it in terms of all hate. We don't like any hate. We're not going to tolerate any hate. But what's happening is really a level of anti-Semitism that is like exploded, and you're not seeing the same level of hate towards any other religious group or minority group. And because of being called, the threat of being called a racist, people don't want to speak the truth. And I think what we need to get down to is feeling like it's okay to call out the truth, and you're not going to be called racist just because you're speaking the truth, and you're not going to be called homophobic if you're just speaking facts on the ground. And I think there's that culturally we're just not there, and there's so much fear, particularly here in the UK. And I know you're struggling with your own definition of Islamophobia and Islamophobia hate speech. And we're seeing the same thing in Canada with this anti-Palestinian racism language. So there's so much stuff that's happening out there to protect sort of all other peoples. And it's leaving the Jewish community very vulnerable. But I think at the core of it is we can't be afraid. So we can't just say it's a lost cause, we're throwing in the towel. We need to speak up and punch back about things that just don't make sense. It's not rational. And get over the fact that, we're going to be called haters, and accept that it's not hate speech to be just calling out some of the facts.
I think you've hit on something really important there. The idea is that they will call you racist, actually, and they will call you fascist and a bigot. But I think you have to, brush it off. You can't stop them calling you that, but what you can do is be sure within yourself that you're not. And I think I felt that a lot around the BLM thing, actually, because when it came over here, I kept getting told I'm a racist by people. And when I said, I really don't think I am, actually, we go, there you go. The fact that you can't even acknowledge it means you are. You don't even recognize your inherent racism. It's a bit of a circular argument. And I think that when you talk about cancellation for these things, of course, the worst kind of cancellation we've heard over years about people being cancelled for their views and for speaking out and for opinions that people, let's say in a mainstream consensus, though I would debate both of those, disagree with. The worst kind of cancellation, of course, is what happened to Charlie Kirk recently. And, there is a surefire way to silence somebody who is saying things you don't like, and that is killing them. And it's not just Charlie Kirk. I mean, it's across both sides, whether it's on the right or the left. The increase in violence against people with different political views, with political views that someone doesn't like. In the States, you have the issue of having guns as well, which means that when people don't like you, they can attack you with a gun. That's a whole other debate. But I made a video recently that went quite viral about what I'm calling climate change. And I'll just run it by you and actually see how you think your work fits in with it. Basically, the climate change movement went through a decades-long struggle to convince people that there was, a rise in temperatures, and that rise in temperatures in its first stage, it had to persuade people was as a result of things that humans have done. And at that point, once it had got through that stage of teaching people or convincing people that that was the case, it then had to go through a phase of convincing people that there were things they could do which would help decrease that rise in temperature. And then, of course, you end up with policies like net zero and these aims to try and reduce it completely. And I would say that actually the climate emergency that the world is truly facing is the one that you're tackling in your work, which is the climate of hate. And the temperature is rising. It has risen. We've seen it. The death, the killing, the murder of Charlie Kirk, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, and all the others who've been shot or had their homes burnt down in the States and here. Just recently, a Labour MP, the deputy leader of Labour Friends of Israel, had her constituency office burnt down and spray painted on the walls. All of these acts of violence are aimed at people for their thoughts and their positions and their opinions. And it is the result of human behavior. So where are we on that spectrum, in your opinion, of acknowledging climate of hate with the heat rising, of convincing people that our actions have created that climate emergency, and then convincing them that they can change those actions by modifying their behavior? It seems like a very big task.
We are in such a scary time. It is so ugly on both sides of the aisle as far as American, the political spectrum. It's coming from the extreme left. It's coming from the extreme right. The celebration of the murder of Charlie Kirk was so stunning to me on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of extremism. It's just wild to witness what's happening. In our film, we talk about this horseshoe theory when it comes to anti-Semitism, and that the only things that people on the far left and the far right agree about is hating Jews. And I just think that we're in this mad moment of hate. and it's around the world, and we're seeing populist leaders, it's like dog whistles to their constituencies that are just stirring the pot and creating more hate, and it's turning into violence. We've been seeing it really around the world, particularly the past few years. And it's really scary. There are people out there like Charlie Kirk who, can use provocative language, but have civil discourse. And yet, we saw him murdered for his views. And it's just really, really stunning and scary for, I think, anyone out there. Wherever you are, politically, wherever you are sort of in the ideological spectrum, it's chilling. It really is.
And it's also tribal, isn't it? Because when we watch, I think, violence in the Middle East, there's been a tendency for many of us in the UK or in America to feel distant from it. When we see people being killed because of who they are, we saw the Alawites or the Druze being slaughtered in Syria. We've seen wars and battles like that taking place in Middle Eastern countries. We've seen Israelis being attacked effectively for being a Jewish state by Palestinians. We've seen Palestinians attacking other Palestinians for tribal loyalties. We've seen Egypt refusing to let Palestinian refugees into Egypt. I think many of us have felt distant from that, and in reality, we're not. The murder of Charlie Kirk, the attempted assassination of a presidential candidate, now the president, those things are equally tribal, and perhaps we're not so different from those people in the Middle East after all, right?
I think we always like to think that we're better, that somehow we're first world, we're more civil, and it's just not the case. I mean, it is another issue to get into the gun violence in America, where schools are being shot up, every other day. There's a lot of hate out there, and yes, firearms are a huge part of the problem. But yeah, the tribalism that we're seeing really feels like it could be happening right in any of these other areas around the world, in any conflict region in the Middle East, in any so-called third world country that doesn't have the same so-called liberal values that we do, or aren't as educated as we are, and yet we're just the same. And again, I just go to the fact that people are celebrating this. Something is going on in our world that's not okay. And I think it's also just going back to this idea of just shutting down dissent that's now really happening in America and in the West. And we've been seeing it. We've been seeing it also on college campuses for a while now, where, and this isn't a violent, instance, but this is speakers being canceled and before they show up because people disagree with them on campus and they feel uncomfortable by what they're about to say. And there's active protests, and that's another reason that speakers will be canceled, because they're fearing the protests that are going to happen when people actually show up, and then maybe even fearing that there'll be a violent incident. What we saw with Charlie Kirk felt like an assassination. In fact, I think it is an assassination. Yeah. It wasn't a big protest with an angry mob that got violent and hostile, but it was a targeted assassination, which is a whole other level of, I think, fear that just anyone out there in the world who's speaking like you do, Jonathan, like I am right now, is fearful. So something is happening in our society, and no, we're no better than any place else.
And there's a lot of people talk about the possibility of civil war here in the UK because of things like two-tier policing and because of injustices and people's speech being limited, free speech. Even the US president, JD Vance, has spoken publicly and in the faces of our politicians, telling them that we do not have freedom of speech here anymore. It seems that the world is going through, I think, a sort of rebalancing. What freedoms should be absolute, whether the new concepts that we haven't maybe had to deal with for a long time as humans, whether majorities need protecting from minorities sometimes, whether complete tolerance and bending over backwards to have, what Gad Saad's called suicidal empathy for minority groups that hate you, where we draw the lines, who can draw the lines, how they can draw them. And I think actually, it's a whole other conversation, but COVID was a really big challenge in that. And I think we sort of accidentally failed on the wrong topic. And
Right.
in a way, it's made things worse because more people are primed not to accept diktats. Those were for health. And so we accepted them. Oh, we're going to die. But we're going to die from the other ones too, right? I mean, if people shoot you because you're a controversial debater on a college campus, that's also, a pandemic of hatred. So I think that, what you're doing is so important. And I'm looking forward to the next movie to see, more under the bonnet, the sort of part two of how we got to this place through these engineered financial and ideological battles and infiltrations. And hopefully that will give a lot of us a way out of them. I just want, before we close, to ask you about your personal feelings and background, because we're sitting here, two Jewish people, and I know that the Jewish community around the world is feeling very different from how it did a few years ago. And I think that's had a mixed effect. On the one hand, it's united us, and many people have rediscovered their identity as Jews. And on the other hand, many people have sort of felt terrified, and some have even turned against Israel or Jewishness in other ways. What's been your experience bringing your film around the world, specifically with Jews? And what is your view of where diaspora and Israeli Jewry are going? Are they going in the same direction?
When I wrote my treatment for the film, I wrote it 2 weeks after October 7th. I saw right away, this is epic. I need to document what's happening. And in my first treatment for the film, my tagline was, on October 7th, Hamas attacked Israel. And October 8th, American Jews woke up. And to me, there was this really transformative moment. And I was getting text messages from friends who I think were barely Jewish and maybe been to Israel once or, when they were 13 years old, who were texting me mid-October, I feel bereft. I'm thinking about one friend in particular. I think that sense of feeling gutted actually drove me to start writing the treatment for the film right away, because I wasn't just feeling it. It felt very pervasive in the Jewish community right away. And that's really what I've seen. I mean, I really feel like on October 7th, October 8th, Israelis became more diaspora Jewish, like part of the diaspora Jewry, and American Jews became more Israeli. And there was a real coming together with our communities in a way that I've never experienced before. And taking the film around the world and doing global screenings, I've met just group after group from Australia to Scotland of Jews who said, I was not at all part of the Jewish community. I just wasn't. I mean, maybe their kid went to a Jewish day school just because it happened to be the best school in the neighborhood. But they didn't identify as Zionists. They didn't identify as like, quote unquote, pro-Israel or at all active. And then after October 7th, they formed organizations. I mean, we have a name for it. We call them October 8 Jews, who literally came together to say, we've got a problem. I was just screening in Scotland recently. They have a tiny Jewish population. All of Scotland only has 5,000 Jews. And I think our screening was the biggest event of the Jewish community in all of Scotland in the past, 20-something years. And the levels of anti-Semitism they're seeing on their university campuses and at Edinburgh and in Glasgow, but also in their communities with like literally no Zionists allowed signs, are bringing people to gather and to do something to fight back and to approach members of parliament and their school boards and the university administrators. So what I'm seeing is a community that's trying to, not even struggling, but finding its voice and coming together and creating a village of unity to do something, to not accept the complacency anymore that for so long we've had around the world. And for various reasons. In America, I said earlier, I think the Jewish community felt like they were doing they were pretty comfortable. I think in other parts of Europe here, and certainly in the UK, things have been uglier. I always say that the UK is about a dozen years ahead of America and his levels of anti-Semitism and what you're seeing.
Well, you know,
And
two shootings outside a Jewish museum, Molotov cocktails. I'm not sure.
we're catching up. We're honestly, I think we're catching up just by the population numbers, and the demographics of the UK are very different than America, at least right now, with, you know, the Muslim population here and people who are coming from outside, and because of borders and immigration laws have been a little bit different. But that extremism that has been occurring in Europe for a longer time, we're now really seeing in America. And before, I think our fear was neo-Nazis, just people on the right. And now what we're seeing are threats really from the left. And I think that has been really eye-opening for the American Jewish community. You know, we're 75%, 80% registered Democrats. So we really hold on to our progressive liberal values in America. It's very much part of our identity, part of our DNA, certainly my DNA. And I think we've seen a shift post-October 7th with that too, politically, and who we're aligning with and who we're comfortable with, and why we feel so abandoned by what happened on October 7th and afterwards by our own organizations and progressive organizations. The chessboard is really shifting right now. And so I think that, again, waking up and saying we need to create new institutions for ourselves, and we need to create more accountability. We also need to come together, because the Jewish community, you know, certainly in the States, and I would argue around the world, is pretty fractured, but definitely in the States politically.
When did it become right-wing to be Jewish? That's the question. And I think that many Jews who don't consider themselves right-wing but do recognize that the left is not looking after them, don't naturally go right. They just feel lost or homeless. And in the end, there's a tribalism even in how we vote. So they'll revert to what they feel safe with, I think. Certainly, you know, to generalize, that seems to be the case in the States. But now, do you think there is going to be a shift? For example, you know, the idea of having a mayor in New York who is terrifying to, I think, most Jews, I think it's fair to say. The fact that even the Biden administration, while it was very supportive of Israel in some respects, certainly didn't compare to how Trump has been. And you can argue with which bits of the war you agree with and don't. But is there a sense among American Jewry that maybe they had made their tribal allegiances to the Democrat Party their Judaism, and that the two things aren't actually necessarily the same, that, you know, tikkun olam and social justice are not actually the same as Judaism, what they call tikkun olam. Have you experienced this refocusing, or actually are people just being entrenched where they are on that spectrum?
I think people feel like they don't have a political home anymore. And to be fair, there are plenty of people in the Republican Party and certainly right-wing extremists who are very anti-Semitic and who also don't support Israel. The tide's also turning on that too. So we cannot say the Republican Party is more supportive of Jews. Let's just start with that. Politically, they have maybe been a little bit more supportive of Israel in recent years, but there are plenty of people in the Democratic Party and plenty of Democrats who are supportive of Israel, who consider themselves pro-Israel.
Who would you say, other than Richie Torres?
Oh, there are Jewish members. There's Dan Goldman. There are plenty of people, and plenty of newly elected people who are also Black women, and people who, you know, are progressive but also pro-Israel. And you mentioned AIPAC before, and by the way, AIPAC's really gotten into the game of throwing their money behind congressional races right now, and they're supporting pro-Israel candidates, many of whom are on the left, many of whom are in the Democratic Party. So there are plenty of people in the Democratic Party, but what I would argue are that people are afraid, you know, and they're afraid of being primaried, and they're afraid of being primaried now by the DSA, the Democratic Socialists movement. And since the Mamdani sensation, like, he was basically sort of a buoy in the tsunami, right? If he could get elected in the state of New York with the largest Jewish population in America and have a lot of support from the Jewish community, it bodes really well for DSA candidates throughout America. And they're seeing a real boost to their movement right now, and that becomes very concerning. So that's going to show a more extreme shift in the Democrats. I still argue, and I think all the polls even suggest this, that most Americans are very centrist in their political values. But the problem is our political elections and the way the primary system works and all of that. And there's a lot of noise on the other side. So we're seeing a lot of resistance. But when it comes to the Jewish community, I think a lot of people are feeling, again, very abandoned, are very, we're feeling a sense of urgency. And in the place that so many of us identify with progressive values and supporting LGBTQ rights and acknowledging that there are climate change issues happening out there and science is real. And there's lots of other issues at stake, and the abortion issue, which is a huge issue in America. And so there's so many other issues that the Jewish community identifies with. But at the end of the day, when we feel like our existence and the state of Israel, it's so existential, and it's so about who we are, and that we're under attack as a community, and that there's real fear happening in our communities and our schools, with synagogues being firebombed. You know, my local synagogue was firebombed. It's a real wake-up call for the community as to what we need to be doing to really, and there is like a desire to find elected officials who are going to punch back harder and really stand up and have a sense of moral clarity and not be afraid and not just roll over to the ideas that they're being called racist if they are somehow supporting the Jewish community.
So is there a future for Jews in America?
Yeah. There's a lot of Jewish Americans who are considering getting second passports. It's a huge conversation, and it's ironic to consider getting passports to be able to be a citizen of Germany, of all places, which is actually something that I'm considering for my own children, since my mother-in-law was German, and on the last kinder transport to England, my kids actually qualify for German passports. There's conversations about making Aliyah and moving to Israel. I mean, I think here in the UK, there's a lot of conversation. I was just in Paris doing screenings, and a lot of Parisian Jews, as we know, are leaving France to go to Israel. So the same conversations are happening in the States. We're not there yet. I think it's still, you still feel pretty safe to be Jewish in America, but it's definitely a conversation.
Surely the aim is not to get there yet. The aim is to plan ahead. So while you've outlined, and we all do, and we're all doing the work we do to try to improve these situations, isn't the aim to make sure we've got a good plan?
A plan B, a backup plan.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like to call it a plan B. I think it's plan A. It's if we evaluate the situation in cold hard terms, and we agree it doesn't look likely to go our way in long term. It's not about us, it's about our children and their children and the continuity of our people and our values and our future. Second passports, yeah, I mean, welcome to Europe. It's not the same place it was. So the question is, Aliyah, maybe, move to Israel. That's not necessarily safer statistically for individual Jews, as we've seen. Is the Jewish experience going to be that Jews look inwards, stick together in communities in the diaspora or even within Israel, and build a big wall around them?
Oh, that's such a great question. And I think a little bit of that, and I think that's part of the conversation too. So while I think there's not a mass exodus of American Jews to any other part of the world right now, to Canada, to Europe, or to Israel, the conversation is really, where are we sending our kids to school? That has been a big conversation, because I would just worked on October 8, and so much of it is about university campuses. A lot of the conversations about, where should we send our kids? We're not applying to Harvard. We're not applying to Yale. We're not applying to the Ivy League anymore. And we're seeing numbers rise of Jewish students applying to schools down south. Southern universities that did a better job in the post-October 7th world, that just didn't tolerate the levels of hate speech and targeted harassment to the Jewish community. And frankly, because those the faculty in those university campuses, the climate tends to be a little bit more conservative, or a little bit more centrist, or just not ideological, they have been safer campuses for Jewish students. So that's a lot of the conversation of, where are kids going to school? And there's also talk about, building our own institutions, right? We did that with country clubs in America. When Jews were not allowed to be part of mainstream country clubs or law firms, they built their own. They built their own medical offices. So the Jewish community in America has created its own institutions for, more than 100 years now. And so I think we're going back to that idea again. So is it, creating our own ghettos again? I certainly hope not. People ask me all the time in Q&As after these screenings, what would I do? My kids just actually both graduated from college, so we don't have to face the college choice right now. But is it abandon the Harvards, abandon the Columbias and the Yales and all of that, and just, go down to the University of Miami or University of Georgia? Or do we try to still have a seat at the table? And I would say it's sort of both. It's, whatever people are feeling comfortable with. We don't want to just roll over and concede, and we do want to still have a seat at the table. But at the same time, we should be smart and strategic and be thinking long-term about building up our own institutions.
Wendy, it's been absolutely enlightening, a little bit depressing. And before we tell everyone where they can watch October 8th, depending on where they are in the world, and when we can expect Poison Ivy.
So unfortunately, I still don't have theatrical distribution here in the UK for the film, but we should be on video on demand platforms, Amazon Prime, Apple TV, YouTube, all of the video on demand platforms by December 2025 here in the UK. Reach out to me if you have interest in other screenings. You can always find me at wendysachs@gmail.com. With Poison Ivy, we're looking to have a completed film by spring 2027.
Wendy, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for the work that you're going to continue to do. And thank you for these insights. I know we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm hoping I'm not incredibly depressing. There is some optimism. There is some hope at the end of all of this.
Absolutely. Look, I keep joking that, as we do talks around everywhere, that it's kind of the international misery tour. But there is optimism as well. So I do think, what you're doing is important in as much as it's opening people's eyes, it's giving people hope, and hopefully it's helping to find a solution for some of these problems. We'll never reach perfection, but we can certainly make things a lot better than they are.
But I think people are also getting loud again. The students in my film really had such a strong sense of identity and really doubled down and have such a strong, moral clarity about them that, to me, they're hopeful. To me, they give me hope.
Good. And I'm pleased to say we've done a Jewish goodbye here because we've finished twice now. So.
Perfect.
Thanks a lot.
Perfect. You're welcome.